You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes over and bulldozed their villages, seized their property and their laws? They had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 453 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about Trump firing two members of his administration that testified in the House impeachment hearings. In Afghanistan, 2 U.S. soldiers were killed in an insider attack. I want to talk about a little bit what's going on politically in Iraq and some of the chaos and instability there. All right, everybody, I need you to share the show. You find it online over at the Libertarian Institute. I am the news editor at the Libertarian Institute. I write the daily news roundup, and both the roundup and the podcast can be found on the homepage libertarianinstitute.org. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. Give the podcast a rating and review, a thumbs up, whatever you could do. And you could also donate to the show over at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, so first up on today's show is Trump's firing of Ambassador to the EU, Gordon Sondland, and National Security Council Ukraine expert Alexander Vinland. I've talked about Sondland's testimony in the House impeachment hearing on the show quite a bit. I actually did a show with Joanne Leone on both of these men's testimony that I'll link to in the show notes page. But just to generally summarize, I think especially Sondland produced a lot of testimony and soundbites that were able to be used on MSNBC to make it look like Trump was really doing something nefarious and illegal and dangerous and destructive, when in reality, you know, his statements and what he would actually be able to prove in court is that, you know, he assumed in his role that there was a quid pro quo about Zelensky needing to open an investigation into Burisma and Biden in order to get a meeting with Donald Trump, and then just kind of assumed from there that once the military aid was withheld, it was for the same reason. But he really has nothing other than, you know, that's what he thought the environment and tone was, and then, you know, made assumptions from there. That, you know, even if that is true, and it might be, it doesn't really prove or hold up in any kind of court or law. And so it's not surprising to me at all that Donald Trump would, you know, look to remove these people. Unfortunately, of course, I think this is going to get spun in with the larger Russiagate narrative. And, you know, to some extent, this is Trump's fault and invited by him, that Trump is now purging people who stood up to his pro-Russian Ukraine policy, which is absolutely nonsense. I guess that's probably where we should start first on all of this. And just to point out that Trump expanded military aid to Ukraine to include lethal aid. That's something that Obama had refused to do because of how that escalates tensions with Russia, and then the negative elements within the Ukrainian military, particularly the Azov battalion and other right sector neo-Nazi type. But Trump had no problem arming these people and provided them with Javelin anti-tank missiles. And then at some point, for whatever reason, Donald Trump decided that I'm going to hold up the military aid to Ukraine. Now, there's a lot of corruption that happens in Ukraine. As I point out, there's Nazi elements within the government and military. Trump has had this vague America First idea, which occasionally comes out and usually doesn't practically turn into anything, which him withholding the Ukrainian military aid, that doesn't practically change anything because these programs and purchases are kind of put in place so far in advance that you would have to withhold it for several months for it to actually, I think, have any real impact on weapons going to Ukraine. But because he decided to hold that up, they say, oh, Trump's too pro-Putin, which, again, doesn't make any sense because he had taken a more aggressive Ukraine approach. So when I talk about Trump's Ukraine policy, it's kind of complicated because part of it is him expanding on the Obama war, and at the same time he also then tried to walk it back a little bit. So with the crazy political environment we have in the United States, this gets a little bit complicated to talk about Trump's Ukraine policy and how this all plays out, what people are talking about. But now they're going to say that Trump's policy is too pro-Putin because Trump fired a couple people who were pro giving lethal military aid to the Ukrainians. So I'll say I don't think Trump fired them because of their policy. I think it's just a vindictive thing. And my guess is that, Sondland will definitely be replaced. If Vinland is on the Security Council, just as likely to be some cold warrior as, somebody America first. And so I don't see this changing anything with Trump's policy or being very meaningful in any sense other than Trump taking some vindictive actions. Overall, I don't know how smart it was on Trump to go ahead and do this, but impeachment has been a pretty big win for him. And the Democrats continue to, whine and kind of focus on this issue is probably a good thing for him at this point. And so if he keep that in the news by firing some people who betrayed him, then maybe all the better for Trump. We do now have Ukraine saying the U.S. is holding up a military purchase that they had made. Not a whole lot of clarity on why this is happening. But again, it gets a lot of attention. It's made to be very big news. So, look how Trump is changing the U.S.-Ukrainian policy. Again, we've had this very aggressive policy in Ukraine through the Obama years of orchestrating a coup in the country, backing the coup government in Kiev against the mostly ethnically Russian separatists who saw the government's anti-Russia laws as a real problem from them and, opened up a civil war front. And so as, this war could be ramping down right now, there's a new government administration in Ukraine with Zelensky, and he seems to have a little bit more balanced approach to everything than the coup government the U.S. put in place. European countries like France and Germany seem ready to really help mediate and end this thing. Russia and Zelensky have been able to sit down and engage in large prisoner swaps and transfers. But if the political discourse in the United States, hyper-focusing on Ukraine, says any approach to this that isn't based in countering Russian aggression and turning back Russians and generally, Cold War hawkish, then, you're a puppet of Vladimir Putin. It's going to make it very hard for Trump, I think, to resist just prolonging and continuing this conflict, either by supporting the Ukrainian government or just undermining peace in some other way. All right, 2 Air Force bases in Florida, one being Cape Canaveral, are going to be renamed and placed under the Space Force Command. This is a part of the Space Force becoming the 6th branch of the military. I'm trying to find some figures on how much it's going to cost just to reorganize these 2 bases from Air Force to Space Force. I'm sure it's going to be a lot more expensive than just changing all the signs and letterheads and uniforms and everything. But hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of dollars. I'm going to keep looking for that number. The U.S. has produced this new class of carriers, the Ford class, with the first being the $13 billion USS Gerald R. Ford. This Ford class project, much like the F-35 one, has been plagued with problems and hasn't worked well from the start. Main problems I talked about in the past on the show have been that the lift elevators to bring the planes from underneath up top deck so they could take off don't work very well or regularly, which means that this is essentially like a very large barge. And also we are finding out now that the different kind of radar and defensive systems on the ship, not including the plane, have a lot of problems and will not be able to defend the ship during combat. So again, this is $13 billion that we have sunk into this individual ship, and who knows how many billions on the Ford class carriers as a whole, and they don't work. And it's one of those things where at some point you would think Congress would be upset and may look to take some kind of action against these companies that are producing these weapons at inflated costs, but they all receive donations from them. So I guess we're just allowed to continue to waste all of our money on it. So in the 2020 omnibus spending bill, or it was passed in 2019, December of 2019, it lifted a arms transfer restriction to Cyprus and supported the building of a pipeline in the region. Now, this is something that I don't know as much about as other areas of the world, but there is a lot of energy under the sea of the Eastern Mediterranean, and there's a lot of disputes on who should have access and control of all these different natural gas fields and other kind of energy fields. Turkey has really taken moves in recent years, especially in the past year, to try to lay claim to this. There's Cyprus, which is disputing disputed control. There's a whole bunch of other small islands between Turkey and Greece that have disputed control, even though these are two NATO countries. Israel and Lebanon and Syria all have coastline there, Egypt, and make varying kind of claims to, this area. At one point, I think Turkish ships were like chasing off Italian drilling ships, and now Turkey, according to some, is illegally drilling in that area. And so if the U.S. starts backing different countries here and gets involved in this, it could be another way to, if not bring us into diplomatic and economic conflict with allied countries like Turkey, the fact that there were, placing or giving military weaponry potentially to Cyprus could, turn this into a little bit of a more lethal issue as well. All right, in some good news, a Brazilian court has dismissed the charges against Glenn Greenwald, so very excited about that. Greenwald is one of the really good journalists that we still have. He lives in Brazil. There's a couple of reasons why he's been targeted, and I'm sure it's part of his whistleblowing and reporting, especially on Operation Car Wash and how the Bolsonaro government targeted the former leadership of the country, Lula. But also, Glenn Greenwald's husband is, I think, probably now the most prominent gay politician in Brazil. And the government there, the Bolsonaro government, is pretty right-wing and, America from several generations ago when it comes to gay rights and what they believe, who gay people are and stuff like that. So there's also targeting for that reason. But dismissing the charges against Greenwald is certainly great. I mean, this is a guy we don't want to see in jail, and that way he could keep reporting it and doing great work. But I wouldn't say this is potentially the end. In Brazil, it seems like the executive in Bolsonaro has a whole lot of power to try to, put people in jail and trump up charges against them. So we have some new news from Catalonia, which is, of course, the Barcelona region of Spain looking for independence from Madrid. In 2017, October 2017, they held an independence referendum that was thuggishly repressed by the Spanish government, and then the leaders of Catalonia were either chased into exile or jailed. Well, the region is looking to hold another independence vote and set a date for that, and this is just a part of the effort by these group of people to be able to live in a country is what they're trying to form of their will, rather than be subjected to the rule of Madrid forever, which they don't feel is legitimate. All right, Afghanistan. We had 2 U.S. soldiers killed in an insider attack. So somebody posing to be a member of the Afghan army was actually a member of some other group, or I guess independently, but wasn't there as an intent of fighting in that army, but rather to give himself access to U.S. and Afghani soldiers, and was able to kill 2 American, I believe, Green Berets, wound 6 others, and at least 1 Afghan soldier. These insider attacks are such a problem that at some training facilities, the U.S. has what they call guardian angels, which are snipers that constantly point their scopes at the Afghan army soldiers in case any of them ever picks up their gun and points it at, I guess, an American in an attempt to kill them. I'm not sure if guardian angels were deployed here. This was a case where they would have been effective in shutting down this attack earlier, or maybe if they did and less Americans died. But this is a constant problem the U.S. has had throughout the Afghan war. It really undermines the relationship and the attempts to build an Afghan state and build up an Afghan army. It just goes to show that after 19 years of this, we still can't tell friend from foe in Afghanistan, and it's time to come home. I talked about this a little bit on Friday's show. It was just new news that a U.S. citizen was captured in Afghanistan. They believe the Haqqani network is behind it, and the only other details I've been able to find out so far is this guy is apparently from Illinois. 5 businessmen were killed by an airstrike in Afghanistan in the Farah province. It's unclear who carried out the airstrike. I'm assuming it's either the Afghan government or the U.S. government. The governor of the Farah province is up in arms about this. I guess, if he's looking to improve his province, he's going to have businessmen come in and agree to build things. And if they risk being blown up by the, quote unquote good guys, then it seems like that's going to be pretty unlikely. So, this could be another major flaw in the rebuilding effort. So in the past couple weeks, been talking about Israel on the show quite a bit because of the deal of the century. I point out how this is a bad deal for the Palestinians. I had a recent show titled Steal of the Century, where I go into a lot of the details about this plan and why it's flawed for the Palestinians. But, we're kind of seeing it on display here as the Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu says Israel's already drawing up plans for annexation. Even the Trump administration seems to acknowledge that must be a step too far, because they're saying that they're warning Israel not to make any announcements of annexation before the upcoming election, and they have to get U.S. permission for it first. So the deal of the century is going to be absolutely disastrous. We're already seeing protests breaking out because of it. At least 4 Palestinian protesters in the West Bank have been killed in protest. And then 12 Israeli soldiers were apparently wounded in a car ramming attack by a Palestinian. Iran attempted to launch a satellite, but it failed to reach orbit. Iran has attempted to launch several satellites. I'm not sure if they actually ever put any in orbit, but at least the past 5 tests have failed. The US and the warmongers continually claim that, this is them trying to launch an ICBM or improve their ICBM program. But this doesn't seem to be the case. The technology in rockets doesn't translate all that much from an ICBM program to a space rocket program. And, it's like with the nuclear program, I talked about the dual use technologies on the show. There are some things that cross over, but you can't deny Iran the right to put commercial vehicles in space just like everybody else. The Syrian army is continuing to recapture territory in the Idlib province, and while Turkey continues to threaten to take action if this continues, they haven't done so far. Several Russian soldiers have been killed in recent weeks in the Idlib province as the Syrian government again is looking to retake that territory. It looks like they have positions now surrounding a good chunk of Idlib city. There are potentially a million or so people there, so that this could be pretty nasty fighting like we've seen in other cities, Aleppo, Mosul, Raqqa. All right, so some important news coming out of Iraq, and that is Iraqi intelligence and the military are saying the December 27th rocket attack that hit the, I believe, K1 base in Kirkuk, Afghanistan, Iraq, killing a U.S. contractor. Now, this was an Iraqi base, but that housed U.S. military soldiers, and a contractor was killed. The U.S. has claimed that Kata'ib Hezbollah was behind this attack, although it hasn't provided any evidence for it. And they also say that, this group is supported by Iran. It seems to be true that the group does have some kind of support from Iran, but not that they, take orders from Soleimani or the Ayatollah. Part of the problem with blaming this particular group, KH, is that they haven't operated in the Kirkuk area for quite a while, and so now it's suspected that the Islamic State may have carried out that attack. This is something that I've talked about in the past on the show, how dangerous the escalating tensions between the U.S. and Iran are, just because you have a whole bunch of, radical nut jobs around the Middle East that would love to see two of their main enemies, Iran and the U.S., fight against each other, and how easy it would be able to dupe a fool like Donald Trump into quickly pointing the finger at Iran when possibly, another country or group is behind one of these. So that's something that I talked about when there were the unclaimed attacks going on against tankers in the Persian Gulf, and with, different shelling and rocket attacks across Iraq against different either U.S. diplomatic or military position. Now, I saw some of the establishment foreign policy thinkers quickly dismiss this because don't you know that the ISIS guys always claim responsibility for their attack right away? Well, I guess that's true when they see the biggest advantage of carrying out the attack being the publicity they could garner from it, and showing that, hey, they're still a force to be reckoned with or whatever, and that's trying to drive recruitment or something. Yeah, then they would claim responsibility, but if the intent is to provoke a conflict between the U.S. and Iran, that would undermine that. And so I wouldn't dismiss this claim that this attack could have been carried out by the Islamic State, especially since there's some Sunni villages in the area that are very sympathetic to some of the Islamic State ideology, and it wouldn't be surprising if they're able to rally up some support there to go out and shell a U.S. base, It's also true that the rockets that were used here are all over the Middle East. They're Russian-made or Soviet-made, I guess, and just about anybody could get their hands on them. So Iraq has a new president, and that president was backed and supported during his vote by Iraqi cleric Muqtada Sadr. He is a very important Iraqi cleric. He has a lot of influence, especially over the poor Shia. However, he's now putting some pressure on the new prime minister, saying that if he does not select an independent government, so, different foreign ministers or whatever like that, then he will be removed from office. I'm not sure if, while Muqtada is very popular in Iraq, if he really has the support to just remove a president from office. He does have the biggest Shia voting bloc, but it's not a majority. All right, finish up here with a couple stories from Africa. The U.S. says it carried out several airstrikes against al-Shabaab in January. Talked about how Trump has ramped up that war with very little media coverage. They always claim to kill al-Shabaab or ISIS, but oftentimes once anybody could do some reporting, it turns out that this is blurry at best and that there's a lot of dead civilians along with the militants, if they're war militants. Warring parties in Libya had their first round of UN talks. They didn't reach a deal, but both sides have agreed to future talks. And then France claims to have killed 30 Islamist militants at the end of last week in Mali. 13 French special operations soldiers died here a few months ago. And France has been very involved in trying to fight in that civil war in Mali and then just around the rest of the Sahel region of Africa. I'm sure much like any of the U.S. military efforts in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Libya, whatever, this is just going to continue to spread the Islamic chaos, not contain it and bring it down. All right, that's where I'm going to end the show for today. Hope you enjoyed it. Check out libertarianinstitute.org, at KYAAALE on Twitter, and patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.